A pregnant woman sits alone on a bench in a freezing Montana town. Every door has been slammed in her face. The hotel turned her away. The church threw her out. Even the sheriff walked past without a word. She has $47 sewn into her corset. No husband, no name, and a baby that the whole world has already decided is unwelcome. Then she hears hoofbeats, slow, heavy, deliberate. A man appears out of the darkness. Enormous, scarred, and carrying a secret so devastating it destroyed his first marriage, his first child, and nearly destroyed him. He offers her one thing no one else will: a roof over her head. But this is no love story. Not yet. Because inside that ranch house, behind a locked door he visits every night, is a room preserved like a shrine. A woman's hairbrush with auburn hair still caught in the bristles, dresses laundered, and hanging as if their owner might walk in any moment. And a name he screams in his sleep, a name that is not Sarah's. She married a stranger to save her child. But what she doesn't know is whose ring she's really wearing. Welcome back to Wild West Stories channel, where the frontier comes alive through tales of rugged cowboys, untamed lands, and love forged in fire. If you're new here, this is the place where the Old West still has a heartbeat. This is a story about two broken people who learned that real love isn't built on perfection. It's built on showing up, telling the truth, and choosing each other, even when it's terrifying. It reminds us that the doors the world slams in your face don't define you. The ones you have the courage to open do. Now, before we ride into this story, if these tales of the wild frontier speak to your soul, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a ride. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have trusted a stranger on a dark mountain road? And if someone you know needs a good story tonight, share this one with them. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you.
Wind swept across a Montana hillside, bending the brown grass flat against the earth. A woman stood alone before a small grave. No headstone marked the spot, just a wooden cross weathered to silver gray by years of sun and snow. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, and the child inside her shifted as if it too could feel the weight of what lay beneath that cold ground. Behind her, boot steps crunched in the dirt, heavy, deliberate. A man's voice came low and rough like gravel dragged over iron. "You should not be out in this cold." She did not turn around. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cross and the name that was not carved there. "Who is buried here?" Silence stretched between them. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine sap and coming snow. Then the bootsteps retreated. She stood alone again with the grave and the wind and the child moving inside her. 3 days earlier, the freight wagon rattled into Silver Creek, just as the afternoon sun began its slide behind the Bitterroot Mountains. Sarah Calloway pressed her palm against the wooden seat rail and tried to steady her breathing. The thin air at 4,000 feet made everything harder when you were 7 months pregnant. Every breath felt like it came through a wet cloth, and the baby had been sitting on her lungs for the last 50 miles. Silver Creek was not much to look at. A single main street cut through a valley where the creek itself ran cold and fast with late autumn snowmelt. The buildings were timber and stone, their paint peeling from harsh mountain winters. Ponderosa pines climbed the ridges on both sides of town, their bark smelling of vanilla and warm resin. To the west, the Bitterroots rose jagged and snow-capped, and the air carried the particular smell of a Montana autumn. Wood smoke and horse dung and alkali dust that coated everything white. The wagon driver, a leathery man named Hicks, pulled up in front of the general store and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "End of the line, miss. Silver Creek." Sarah gathered her single carpet bag, the one she had carried all the way from Boston with $47 sewn into the lining of her corset, and climbed down carefully. Her feet were swollen from 8 hours on that bench. Her lower back screamed with every movement. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if protesting the sudden jostling. She remembered another night, another desperate descent, the brown bottle of pennyroyal tincture on her father's desk. Dr. Morton's careful instructions, 3 spoonfuls, and the problem resolves itself. Her father's hand pushing the bottle toward her, the relief in his exhale when she picked it up. Then the sound of glass shattering against the marble fireplace, amber liquid running down the stone, her father's face shifting from relief to fury in the space of a heartbeat. She had run upstairs, climbed out the bedroom window at 10 o'clock at night, 7 months pregnant, her hands gripping the ivy trellis while her belly pressed against cold brick. She had dropped her carpet bag to the garden below and lowered herself down inch by terrifying inch. That was the woman who now stood in the dust of Silver Creek, Montana, a woman who had already gone to war for her child before the story even started. The hotel was the first door that closed in her face. The clerk, a thin man named Loomis, looked her up and down with the particular expression she had come to know well over the past weeks. His eyes went to her belly, then to her bare ring finger, then to the door. "We are full up." There were 3 empty key hooks on the board behind him. Before Sarah could argue, Loomis sent a boy running down the street, and 2 minutes later Sheriff Wade Dawson appeared. He was young, maybe 34, and he could not meet her eyes. He shifted his weight from boot to boot and spoke to a spot somewhere above her left shoulder. "I am sorry, Mom. Council ordinance. I have to ask you to move along from the respectable establishments." He said respectable, like the word tasted bad in his mouth. Sarah studied him. He was not cruel. He was weak. There was a difference, and she filed it away for later. At the general store, old Tom Bridgers sold her dried beef and hardtack, but charged her triple the marked price. Sarah knew she was being gouged. She counted the coins out slowly, one by one, making sure Bridger watched her count, letting him know she understood exactly what he was doing. Then she paid, because she was hungry and her baby needed food, and pride did not fill an empty stomach. The church was the cruelest cut. Reverend Matthews, a mild-faced man with watery eyes, allowed her to sit on a pew and rest her swollen feet. For 10 minutes she closed her eyes and felt the ache in her back ease just slightly. Then the vestry door opened and a pinch-faced woman swept into the sanctuary. "We are not a charitable house, Reverend. She will need to move along." Prudence Matthews, the Reverend's wife. Sarah watched Matthews open his mouth to object, then close it. She watched a man choose his wife's cruelty over his own conscience. She had seen this before. Her father had chosen reputation over his daughter. Edward Langley had chosen his existing family over the woman carrying his child. Men were forever choosing the easier wrong over the harder right. By the time the sun touched the ridgeline, Sarah had been turned away from every establishment in Silver Creek. She needed to relieve herself desperately, but no door would open for her. She finally went behind the brush at the edge of town, squatting awkwardly with her belly in the way, tears of humiliation burning her eyes while the baby pressed on her bladder, and the cold crept up through the soles of her worn boots. Evening found her on the bench outside the closed mercantile. The temperature was dropping fast. Montana autumn nights could plunge to 35 degrees, and her thin wool traveling dress was no match for it. She ate the last of the overpriced dried beef and pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. Sheriff Dawson passed again, paused, opened his mouth, closed it, walked on. Sarah watched him go and thought, at least have the decency to say what you mean, instead of apologizing with your eyes while you leave me here to freeze. Darkness came. The stars overhead were sharp as broken glass, brighter than anything she had seen in Boston. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter and felt the baby shift inside her. A slow roll, as if the child was trying to get comfortable in a world that had already decided it was unwelcome. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not the usual town traffic. Most horses had been stabled for the night. These hoofbeats were heavy, slow, deliberate, coming from the north end of the street, from the direction of the mountains. Sarah wiped her eyes quickly. A reflex, never let them see weakness. She looked up. The rider was enormous. So large he seemed to swallow the moonlight behind him. A black horse, massive, at least 17 hands, stopped in the middle of the street. The man sat motionless in the saddle, scanning the town with the practiced sweep of someone checking for threats. His gaze landed on her, held. He dismounted, walked toward her. Each step landed like a sentence being carved in stone. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to see, far enough to not crowd. "Can you stand?" Not a polite question, almost a command. A voice like gravel dragged over iron. Colton Drake had been watching the woman since she stepped off the freight wagon. He had seen the hotel clerk send for the sheriff, watched old Bridger gouge her at the general store, saw Prudence Matthews chase her from the church pew like she was something unclean that might stain the wood. He had been sitting on Thunder at the north end of the street for 2 hours, arguing with himself. The woman pressed her hand to her belly, and he saw it. Another hand on another belly, smaller fingers, a silver wedding band, a laugh that had sounded like creek water over stones. Then blood. So much blood. The memory hit him like a mule kick to the chest, and he gripped the reins until the leather bit into his palms. "Ride home," the voice in his head said. "She is not your problem. She is not Eliza. Ride home." He watched the woman shiver on that bench, watched Dawson walk past her without stopping. She is not Eliza. He dismounted. But she could be. The woman looked up at him with eyes that were red-rimmed but sharp, calculating. Even in her state, she was measuring him. He could see her mind working behind those green eyes, cataloging details the way a scout reads terrain. "Can you stand?" he said again. "I do not know you. Nobody in this town wants to know you. I do not either. But I do not leave a woman with child to freeze in the street. That is not a reason to trust you. Did not say it was. Said I would get you out of the cold. That is the only thing on the table." She studied him for a long moment. He could tell she was running some kind of calculation. His hand was not near his gun. His horse was still tied to the post. He was not positioned for any kind of quick action. And his eyes, she noticed this, he could tell, his eyes kept sliding away from hers. Men who meant harm did not avoid eye contact. Men who were terrified of what they were doing avoided eye contact. She stood. He lifted her onto Thunder with both hands, careful of her belly, and then did something that surprised her visibly. He did not mount behind her. Instead, he took the reins in his left hand and started walking. The trail followed Silver Creek upstream, climbing steadily into the mountains. Ponderosa pines closed in on both sides. Moonlight came and went as clouds crossed the sky. Once an owl screamed from the trees and Thunder shied hard. Colton steadied the horse with a low murmur that Sarah could not quite hear, but the animal responded to immediately. The walk took over an hour. Colton could have ridden and cut the time in half, but he did not want his weight on the horse with a pregnant woman aboard. He absorbed the cost of that consideration with his own legs, in the dark, on rocky terrain. He did not explain why. She figured it out on her own. He could tell by the way she went quiet on the horse's back, studying him differently than before. The Triple D ranch materialized out of the darkness, like something built by a man who expected the world to try to knock it down. The main house was 2 stories of hand-hewn ponderosa pine chinked with lime mortar. The roof was local slate, expensive and built to last a lifetime. Beyond it stood a large horse barn, 2 cattle sheds, a blacksmith forge, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a chicken coop. This was not an outlaw hideout. This was a serious operation, built by serious hands. Martha Kincaid appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her fingers. She was 55 years old, with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had seen enough grief to last 3 lifetimes. She saw Sarah, saw the belly, looked at Colton. 3 expressions crossed her face in 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, something close to fear. Colton. "No, you cannot. She needs a place for the night. That is all. That is what you said about the last stray dog, and it is still sleeping on the porch." Martha. His voice dropped to the register that ended conversations. Martha pressed her lips together, nodded, led Sarah upstairs. At the landing, Martha paused without looking back. The room at the end of the hall. Not the other one. The room she showed Sarah was clean, comfortable, a real bed with quilts, a wash basin with fresh water. Too clean, too ready. As if someone had been maintaining this room for years. On the vanity table sat a silver-backed hairbrush. Sarah picked it up and turned it over. On the back, engraved in flowing script, were two initials. E.D. A single strand of long auburn hair was still caught in the bristles. She opened the wardrobe. Inside hung 3 dresses, a woman's riding coat, and a pair of kid leather gloves. Not dusty, not moth-eaten. Someone had been laundering and airing these clothes, as if the owner might walk through the door any evening and need them. Sarah set the hairbrush down carefully. The room felt different now. Not empty, not waiting for a guest, waiting for someone to come home. Morning light changed everything and nothing. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and salt pork, and lay still for a moment examining the room in daylight. On the walls she noticed faint rectangular outlines where pictures or a mirror had once hung but been taken down. The empty dresser drawers still held the ghost of dried lavender. Someone had removed personal items from this room, but could not erase every trace. It felt like a room where evidence had been cleared, and the question that had kept her awake half the night pressed against her skull like a headache. Evidence of what? She dressed in her only clean dress, a brown cotton that was getting tight around her middle, and went downstairs. The kitchen was warm from the cook stove. A man she had not seen the night before sat at the table eating with the slow economy of someone who had been working since before dawn. He was perhaps 60 years old, black, with white stubbled jaw and eyes that evaluated without hostility. His hands were massive and scarred and held his fork with surprising delicacy. He looked at Sarah, looked at her belly, looked back at his plate. "Boss says you are here for the night. Sun is up now. What is your plan? No pity? No judgment? Just the practical question." Sarah appreciated that more than she could say. "I am working on it." Martha served breakfast without looking directly at Sarah. When Sarah thanked her, the older woman said quietly, "Do not thank me. Thank him, and pray he knows what he is doing." Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the back door opened and Colton Drake filled the frame. In daylight, he was even larger than he had appeared the night before. 6'4" at least, with shoulders that could block a doorway. The scar running from his left temple to his jaw was a livid white line against tanned skin, and it continued below his jaw, down his neck, disappearing into his shirt collar. Someone had tried very hard to kill this man and failed. He was muddy from hours of work. He had been up since 4, the man at the table told her later, tracking fence lines and checking the creek level in the north pasture. "Do you have a plan?" Colton said without preamble. "I will take the next wagon to Helena. I have enough money to start. Helena is 80 miles through mountain passes. The wagon road washes out twice a season. You would be on a freight bench for 3 days in your condition, assuming the axle does not break on the switchbacks above Garrison." Silence settled over the kitchen. Martha stopped stirring. The man at the table, who Sarah would learn was called Buck Travers, kept his eyes on his plate, but she could tell he was listening with every fiber of his being. "So, what do you suggest?" Sarah said. "I live in your barn. I suggest you think practically instead of proud." It was not a kind thing to say, but it was true, and Sarah had learned during her long journey west that truth was worth more than kindness most days. The tension between them was real and raw, not attraction, not romance. 2 stubborn, damaged people who irritated each other. Sarah resented being dependent. Colton resented that she reminded him of something he was trying to forget. Neither of them was being their best self, and they both knew it. After breakfast, Colton rode out to check on his cattle, and Buck went with him. Martha retreated to the back of the house to do laundry. Sarah was alone. She explored the property. Not snooping, she told herself. Getting oriented. The ranch was impressive. The barn held 8 horses in good condition. The cattle sheds were well maintained. The blacksmith forge still held warm coals. Everything spoke of a man who worked hard and knew what he was doing. In the horse barn, she found a mare favoring her left foreleg badly. The animal stood in her stall with her weight shifted, and when Sarah approached slowly and knelt to look, she found a deep gash from barbed wire, half-infected and weeping. No one was around. The ranch hands were out with Colton. Sarah did not wait for permission. She heated water on the barn stove, cleaned the wound with care, talking softly to the mare the whole time. From her carpet bag, she retrieved the small collection of herbs she had carried all the way from Boston. Calendula for infection, comfrey for healing. She made a poultice and applied it to the gash, then fashioned a proper bandage from clean cloth strips she tore from a feed sack. It was the one practical inheritance from Cousin Henry and his medical school textbooks. Her father would have been horrified to know she had spent years secretly studying anatomy, herbalism, and basic midwifery from books meant for male eyes only. But those books had kept her sane during the long, dark months of her pregnancy, and the knowledge in them was proving worth more than the $47 in her corset. By the time Colton returned at midday, the mare was standing easier, putting weight on the injured leg for the first time in days. He examined the bandage without a word. Professional quality, the poultice properly applied, the wrapping tight but not constricting. He looked at Sarah. Something shifted behind those cold, dark eyes. He did not say anything, but he looked at her differently after that. That evening after supper, after Martha had gone to her quarters and Buck had returned to the bunkhouse, Sarah sat in the parlor attempting to mend a tear in her only other dress. A knock on the door frame made her look up. Colton stood in the hallway. He did not enter the room. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, keeping physical distance between them. "I have a proposition," he said. "You will think I have lost my mind. I thought that last night." The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but close. The first crack in that granite exterior she had seen. "Marry me, on paper. The child takes the Drake name. Nobody touches you again." Sarah set down her mending. The needle pricked her finger, and she barely noticed. She stared at this enormous scarred stranger who was offering her the one thing she had not dared to hope for. A name, protection, a future. Why? "I have my reasons. That is not good enough. It is what I have got. Then I need to think about it. Take the night. If the answer is no, I will put you on the Helena wagon myself and pay your way." He turned to leave. Sarah called after him. "What do you get out of this?" He paused, did not look back. "A chance to do something that matters," he said, and walked into the darkness. Sarah sat for a long time after he left. The fire crackled. The wind moaned around the eaves. The baby turned slowly inside her, a lazy roll that pressed against her ribs. She was still sitting there when she realized she needed air. The house felt too warm, too close, too full of questions she could not answer. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and went out the back door toward the barn, intending to check on the mare one more time. She was almost to the barn door when she heard voices inside. Colton and Buck. She stopped, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to make herself move. "You sure about this?" Buck said. His voice was deep and careful. "No. You know what happens if Garrett finds out you took a wife. He will use her to get to you." "I know." "Then why?" Silence. She heard the rustle of a saddle blanket being folded, set down, picked up again, then Colton's voice, barely audible, raw with something she could not name. "I cannot let that happen again, Buck." Sarah pressed her back against the barn wall. The baby kicked hard against her palm, her heart hammered. That. What was that? What had happened before that was so terrible this man would marry a stranger to prevent it from happening again? She crept back to the house and lay awake until dawn, turning the question over and over in her mind like a stone she could not stop touching. In the morning, she found Colton in the kitchen before anyone else was up. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at nothing. He looked like he had not slept either. "I will do it," Sarah said. "I will marry you. But I have terms." "Name them." "I do not sit idle. I work. I contribute to this ranch. I am not an ornament. You are 7 months pregnant. And I got myself from Boston to Montana alone. Do not underestimate me." He studied her. The corner of his mouth moved. That almost smile again. He nodded. Reverend Matthews arrived at the Triple D Ranch that afternoon, looking like a man being led to his own hanging. He was sweating despite the cool autumn air, and he had brought 2 bottles of whiskey. One for himself, presumably for courage, and one as a wedding gift. His hands shook when he opened his Bible. The ceremony took place in the parlor. Martha stood as witness, crying softly into a handkerchief. Sarah could not tell whether these were tears of joy or grief, and something about that ambiguity unsettled her. Buck stood as second witness, hat in hand, his weathered face unreadable. Sarah wore her brown cotton dress, the only one that still fit. Someone, she suspected Martha, despite the older woman's complicated feelings about the situation, had placed a jar of late-season wildflowers on the mantel. When it came time for the ring, Colton reached into his pocket and produced a simple gold band. His hand hesitated. A full beat of stillness, fingers frozen around the ring, as if some invisible force held them in place. Then something crossed his face. A private war fought and decided in the space of a single breath. He extended his hand and slid the ring onto Sarah's finger. "I promise to honor and protect you," he said, "for as long as you need me." Not standard vows, real words. Real. The weight of them settled on Sarah's shoulders like a coat. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife. Colton leaned down and pressed a brief kiss to her forehead. It lasted half a heartbeat, and she felt the warmth of it for hours after. Matthews left quickly, clutching his whiskey and his fee. Martha served a simple supper of roast venison and potatoes, then excused herself for the night. Buck had already disappeared to the bunkhouse. Sarah and Colton sat across from each other at the kitchen table, married, strangers. "You should take the bedroom at the end of the hall," Colton said. "I will stay in mine, across the house." Sarah nodded. The arrangement had been understood from the beginning, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way the ceremony had not. She went upstairs to the room that belonged to ED and lay down on the bed that smelled of lavender and closed her eyes. The ring felt heavy on her finger. The baby moved restlessly, responding to her racing pulse. Just past midnight, she was jolted awake by gunfire. 3 shots from the north pasture, sharp and flat in the cold air. Then silence. Then 2 more shots. Sarah was out of bed before she fully understood what was happening. She stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold floor, listening to gunfire in the Montana darkness. This was her wedding night, and her husband had disappeared through the door with a rifle in his hands before she could speak. Martha appeared on the stairs, calm as stone and wrapped in a housecoat. "Rustlers," she said simply. "Happens 2 or 3 times a year. Mr. Drake handles it." More gunfire. Then silence. A longer silence that stretched and stretched until Sarah's nerves hummed like telegraph wire. The front door opened. Colton came through it with Thunder's reins in one hand and his rifle in the other. There was blood on his left shoulder, dark against his shirt, spreading slowly. "Just a scratch," he said. "Sit down," Sarah replied. She was already reaching for the kettle. She heated water, threaded a needle from her sewing kit, cut away the torn fabric of his shirt to reveal the wound, a graze from a bullet that had come close enough to take meat, but not close enough to hit bone. It was bleeding freely and needed stitches. She worked quickly and steadily, her fingers on his skin, the needle passing through flesh while he sat still as granite, his jaw tight, not flinching. She could feel the heat of his body, smell leather and gunpowder and sweat. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. Up close, she could see that the scar on his face continued below his jaw, down his neck into the hollow of his collarbone. A saber wound, she thought. Someone had tried to take his head off. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, watching her work. "Books. Books taught you to stitch a bullet graze. Books and stubbornness." He almost smiled. Third time she had almost gotten a real smile from this man. She was keeping count without meaning to. When she tied off the last stitch, their eyes met. Close. Lamplight. The first moment of genuine intimacy between them, and it had come through necessity rather than desire. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Do not get shot again. I will try." He went to his room. She went to hers. The house settled into silence, but Sarah did not sleep, because from down the hall, through the walls, she heard Colton's voice, fragmented by nightmare, twisted with anguish. "Eliza, do not go. Come back. I will be there. Just come back. Come back. Not I am sorry you are gone. Not rest in peace. Come back." Sarah stared at the ceiling. The words rearranged themselves in her mind like puzzle pieces, finding their places. Eliza did not die. Eliza left, and Colton was still waiting for her to return. The fresh clothes in the wardrobe, the maintained room, the missing pictures removed so a new wife would not ask questions. Her hand found the gold band on her finger. She turned it slowly in the dark. What have I married into? The next morning a letter arrived with the weekly mail delivery. No return address, postmark from New York. Sarah took it from Martha at the door and opened it with cold fingers. Inside was a single line of handwriting she recognized like a scar on her own skin. "I know where you are." Her hands shook. She folded the letter, walked to the cookstove, and fed it to the flames. She watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. She told no one. Sarah approached Martha in the kitchen the following morning while Colton was out checking fence lines. "Who is Eliza?" The plate Martha was holding hit the floor and shattered. Ceramic shards scattered across the boards. Silence stretched between them while Martha knelt slowly, her hands trembling as she gathered the pieces. "Where did you hear that name?" "He calls it in his sleep. Every night." Martha did not look up. "You should ask him. I am asking you. And I am telling you this is his to tell, not mine." She would not say more. Sarah helped her sweep up the broken plate and then sat at the table thinking. Martha moved through the kitchen with the careful deliberateness of a woman holding something fragile inside her chest. Sarah decided she would find the answers herself. She searched the house systematically that afternoon while everyone was out. Upstairs first. At the far end of the hallway, past her room and past Colton's room, there was a door she had noticed but never tried. She tried it now. Locked. She went to the kitchen and collected every key on the hook ring by the back door. Tried each one. None fit. In the storage room off the barn, she found wooden crates nailed shut with the letter E penciled on the lids. She did not open them. Not yet. But she noted their existence. In Colton's office, a small room off the parlor where he kept the ranch books, she found what she was looking for. He left the ledgers and files accessible. He trusted her with his finances, apparently, even if he would not trust her with his past. The land deed was filed with the territorial recorder in Helena. Names listed as owners of the Triple D Ranch: Colton James Drake and Eliza Ann Drake. Date of filing, March 1864. Sarah searched every drawer, every folder, every scrap of paper in that office. She found cattle records, supply orders, tax payments, letters from stock buyers in Helena and Butte. What she did not find was a death certificate. No record of burial, no probate filing, no evidence whatsoever that Eliza Drake was dead. She sat back in the office chair and placed both hands on her belly. The baby was quiet for once, as if listening. Either Eliza Drake was dead and Colton was hiding a ghost, or she was alive and Sarah had married a man who already had a wife. If Eliza was alive, the marriage was illegal. The baby had no legal father, and Sarah was exactly where she had started. Worse, because now she had allowed herself to hope. That same afternoon, Colton rode up the creek to check the water level and found it dangerously low, far too low for natural seasonal variation. He followed the creek upstream for 2 miles and discovered a freshly built log dam on land belonging to Silas Garrett, diverting water away from Triple D pastures. 2 of Garrett's hired men sat on the dam with rifles across their knees. They did not aim. They did not need to. They smiled. Mr. Garrett sends his regards, and his congratulations on the wedding. Colton looked at the dam, looked at the men. If he tore it down, it was destruction of property on Garrett's claim. Garrett would have a legal complaint filed before sundown. If he left it, his cattle would start dying in 2 weeks. He rode home with a face like a closed fist. That evening, Sarah placed the land deed on the dinner table. "Who is Eliza?" Colton saw the document. His jaw locked. A vein pulsed at his temple. "Where did you find that?" "In your office. Along with no death certificate, no burial record, no probate filing. Who is Eliza Drake and where is she?" 5 seconds of silence. 10. The fire popped in the stove. The wind pressed against the windows. Then Colton stood, picked up his hat, walked out. The door closed behind him, not slammed, which was almost worse. A controlled departure. A man choosing walls over words. Sarah sat alone at the table with the lamp flickering and the land deed in front of her. She was angry. But she was also, for the first time, afraid. Not of violence, of the possibility that she was living in a dead woman's house, or worse, a living woman's house. Before the confrontation, Buck had mentioned something that now took on new weight. Colton had to ride into town next week to sign updated land papers at the territorial office. Both signatures were required, husband and wife. Sarah would have to stand before the town council as Mrs. Colton Drake and answer questions about their marriage. She had 7 days to decide how much she trusted a man who would not answer her questions. That night after midnight, Sarah heard footsteps on the upper landing, soft, deliberate, the careful tread of someone trying not to make noise. She cracked her door open and watched. Colton stood before the locked door at the far end of the hall. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out a key hanging from a leather cord around his neck, hidden against his chest. He opened the door. Warm light spilled out from a candle or lamp already burning inside. He stepped through. The door closed behind him. Sarah stood in the dark hallway, one hand on her belly, one hand braced against the wall. The baby kicked, a hard, sharp jab, as though it too could feel her heartbeat hammering. She considered walking to that door, pressing her ear against it, knocking. She did neither. She went back to her room and lay awake until dawn, listening for the creak of floorboards that would tell her when he left the locked room. He did not leave it until the sun came up. A second letter arrived 2 days later. Same lack of return address, different postmark. This one from Chicago, as though the sender was moving west. "That child is mine. You have no right to give it another man's name." Sarah burned it like the first. Her hands shook worse this time. She pressed them flat against the kitchen table and held them there until the trembling stopped. She told no one. Sarah decided she was done waiting for Colton to explain. He would tell her when he was ready, or she would find out herself. But she would not sit in this house spiraling into fear and suspicion while the walls closed in around her. Martha mentioned over breakfast that the 8-year-old son of the Tucker family, dirt-poor homesteaders on the edge of town, had been running a high fever for 4 days. Dr. Whitfield was on a bender, had been since Tuesday, and could not hold a lancet steady even if someone dragged him to the boy's bedside. Sarah packed her herb bag, told Buck to hitch the wagon, did not ask Colton's permission. He was in the north pasture, and she was a grown woman with medical knowledge and a child who needed her help. Buck gave her a long, measuring look, then hitched the team without argument. The Tucker homestead was a sod house and timber shack combination that had seen better days and probably never good ones. Ruth Tucker, a gaunt woman with work-roughened hands and frightened eyes, led Sarah to the back room where Tommy Tucker lay on a straw mattress soaked with sweat. The boy was gray-faced and barely conscious. His breathing crackled like paper being crumpled, and his fever was high enough that his skin burned under Sarah's palm. She recognized the signs from Cousin Henry's textbooks. Early-stage pneumonia. Not the simple croup or grip that frontier families weathered regularly. This could kill a child if it went untreated. She worked for 4 hours. Steam inhalation with eucalyptus oil over a pot of boiling water, the boy's head tented under a blanket to trap the vapors. Comfrey poultice for the chest, spread thick and warm. Willow bark tea to bring down the fever, nature's own aspirin, bitter as gall but effective. She positioned Tommy on his side to help his lungs drain and stayed at the bedside, monitoring his breathing, adjusting the poultice, spooning willow bark tea between his cracked lips. By late afternoon, the fever broke. Tommy opened his eyes and asked for water in a thin, reedy voice that made his mother sob with relief. Ruth Tucker grabbed Sarah's hands and held them and wept, and Sarah let her. The word spread through the neighboring homesteads within hours. Drake's wife saved the Tucker boy. While Tommy slept and Ruth hovered over him, Sarah noticed a framed photograph on the wall of the main room. A group portrait taken in front of the Silver Creek Church, maybe 4 or 5 years old, the image slightly faded. She recognized Colton immediately, even in his younger form, standing stiffly in a church suit with fewer scars and softer eyes than the man she knew. Beside him, her hand on his arm, was a woman. Auburn hair pinned up beneath a bonnet, a warm smile that reached her eyes, and a visibly pregnant belly beneath her Sunday dress. Eliza. Sarah stared. Eliza had been beautiful. Eliza had been happy. And Eliza had been pregnant in exactly the same way Sarah was now. Same pose, same protective hand on the belly, same hopeful expression on her face. For the first time, the fear of being a replacement had a face. And it was a lovely face, the kind of face a man might spend 4 years trying to forget and never quite managing. Sarah turned away from the photograph. The baby kicked, and she pressed her hand to her side and breathed. On the way back to the ranch, she had Buck stop at the saloon. She needed whiskey for her medicinal stock, proper grain alcohol for cleaning wounds and sterilizing instruments. Buck went in with her, his hand never far from the old army revolver on his hip. Inside, sitting at a table near the window with a glass of brandy and a newspaper from Helena, was a man Sarah had never seen before, well-dressed, clean hands, polished boots that had never walked behind a plow. He rose when he saw her and approached with a smile that had been practiced in front of a mirror until every crease was perfect. "You must be Mrs. Drake, Silas Garrett. I own the mineral claim north of your husband's ranch." He bought her a lemonade before she could refuse. Complimented her medical skill with words that sounded sincere and probably were not. He asked gentle questions that probed like a surgeon's fingers looking for the tender spot. "I'm surprised Drake lets his wife venture out alone," he said. "Heard he was rather particular about keeping what is his close to home." Sarah felt the calculation underneath his courtesy. He was measuring her, testing whether she was Colton's vulnerability. She smiled back. "Just as pleasant. Just as calculating. Mr. Garrett, my husband does not let me do anything. I go where I please. It was lovely meeting you." She left with the whiskey and a knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the baby. When she got back to the ranch, Colton was waiting on the porch. His face was the color of thunderclouds. "Where were you?" "Saving a child's life." "You rode into town without telling me." "With Buck. And I am a grown woman, Colton. You are my wife. Garrett has men all over that town. I met Garrett." The blood drained from Colton's face so fast, Sarah could track its departure like a retreating tide. "What did he say?" "Nothing threatening. But I understand why you are concerned." She could have pushed, could have used his fear as leverage to demand answers about Eliza, about the locked room, about the words he screamed in his sleep. Instead, she changed tactics. "Colton." Sit down. Talk to me. Really talk. I cannot protect myself if I do not know what I am facing. What does Garrett want? Who is Eliza? Why did you really marry me? Those are 3 questions. You owe me at least 2 of 3. He sat. He answered the first and the third, but not the second. Garrett wanted Triple D land, had wanted it for years. The man had tried bribery first, then intimidation, now water diversion. He was slowly strangling the ranch, trying to force a tax auction he could swoop in on. And why he had married Sarah? Because I know what it feels like when nobody wants you. When every door closes, I know that feeling down to my bones, and I would not wish it on anyone. Sincere, but not complete. Sarah could feel the empty space where the full truth should have been, like a missing tooth you kept probing with your tongue. About Eliza, he said only this: not yet. I made a promise I would tell you. I will, but not today. I am asking you to give me time. She accepted, not happily. But she recognized that forcing the issue would drive him further behind his walls, and she was tired of walls. That same day, Colton rode into town to confront Garrett about the dam. Buck went with him. Outside the saloon, they encountered a lean, mean-faced Texan named Virgil Crane, one of Garrett's hired guns. Crane said something about Sarah. Buck told her later, choosing his words carefully, that it was something no decent man would repeat about any woman, let alone one carrying a child. Colton lost control. Not the calculated violence of a soldier or a man defending his property. This was something older and darker. Blind animal rage that erupted from somewhere deep inside him, like a geyser breaking through rock. He dragged Crane off his horse and beat him with his bare fists while the whole street watched. Buck had to physically haul Colton off, wrapping both arms around the bigger man's chest and hauling backward while Colton snarled and fought against the restraint. Crane lay in the dirt with his face a ruin of blood and broken cartilage. Sheriff Dawson stood on the boardwalk, frozen, hand on his gun but not drawing. The whole town saw it. Every person on that street watched Colton Drake prove that every terrible thing they had ever said about him was true. Sarah heard about it from Buck that evening. The old man told her straight, no sugarcoating, no excuses. He told her what Crane had said, though he cleaned it up considerably. And he told her what Colton had done. For the first time since arriving at Triple D, Sarah was afraid of the man she had married. Not afraid he would hit her. She did not believe that, but afraid of what lived inside him. The violence he had told her was buried. The war he had said was over. Colton did not come to dinner, did not come to the house at all. The lamp in the barn burned past midnight and on toward dawn. Sarah sat on the porch in the cold, wrapped in a quilt, watching that lamp burn. Martha came out and sat beside her. "He has not always been like that," Martha said softly. "Like what?" "Violent. Human. He used to be worse. When he first came back from the war, he could not be in the same room with people without flinching. The anger was all he had." Pause. The wind carried the smell of pine down from the mountains. "He is better now. Because of this ranch. Because of Buck. And maybe because of you. That is a lot to put on a woman he has known for 3 weeks." "Yes, it is." Martha went inside. Sarah stayed on the porch. In the barn, the lamp kept burning, and she imagined Colton sitting in the hay with his split knuckles and his ruined reputation and the look on his face that Buck had described to her. Not anger, not satisfaction. Horror. He had looked at his own bloody hands with the expression of a man watching a nightmare come to life. The monster they all said he was had shown its face. And the worst part, the part that kept Sarah on that porch until her fingers went numb, was that Colton had been more afraid of it than anyone. 3 weeks passed. Things healed slowly the way things do when both parties are too stubborn to rush and too wounded to pretend. Colton never made a speech about the violence. He never said, "I'm sorry," with words. Instead, he spent 3 days building a proper medicine shelf in the kitchen for Sarah's herbs. She came downstairs one morning and found it there, every bottle and jar organized exactly as she had described wanting when she was talking to Martha about needing better storage. He had been listening. And he had answered with his hands instead of his mouth. They were growing closer despite everything, or perhaps because of everything. Shared damage has a way of building bridges that comfort never could. He taught her to ride on a placid old mare named Penny, who moved with the enthusiasm of a woman heading to church on a hot Sunday. Sarah sat in the saddle with her belly pressing against the horn, and her hands white on the reins, while Colton walked beside her, one hand on Penny's bridle, ready to grab Sarah if she listed. She taught him to make Boston brown bread, a dark, sticky loaf that required molasses and patience. He ate it without complaint, though she caught him feeding a piece to the barn cat when he thought she was not looking. They laughed more, touched more, his hand at her elbow when she navigated the porch steps, her fingers straightening his collar before he rode out in the morning. Small gestures that meant nothing and everything at the same time. One afternoon, Colton was mending fence in the south pasture, his shirt dark with sweat despite the cool air, and Sarah brought water. She held out the canteen and the sunlight caught her hair and turned it copper. He stopped working. The fence post he had been setting dropped from his hands. He stared at her with an expression that had nothing to do with gratitude for water. "What?" she asked. "You are beautiful." "I am the size of a barn." "Still beautiful." The first kiss was not a perfect romance. He leaned in and his lips hit her nose. She laughed against his mouth, a startled, bright sound that echoed off the mountains, and he turned red from the collar of his shirt to the roots of his hair. The most feared man in the Montana Territory, blushing because he had missed his wife's lips. He corrected course. The second attempt found its mark. Soft, questioning, restrained. She answered by curling her fingers into the front of his shirt and pulling him closer. When they separated, both slightly dazed, he rested his forehead against hers. "I should have aimed better." "You will practice." She was teasing him. And he was smiling. A real smile. The kind that transformed his face from granite to something warm and nearly young and achingly vulnerable. In that moment, with the afternoon sun on their faces and the sound of the creek below and the baby turning slowly between them, Sarah fell. Not gradually, not carefully. She fell the way you fall off a cliff. All at once, with nothing to grab onto and nothing below but faith that someone would catch you. It made what came next so much worse. Dr. Whitfield came to the ranch for Sarah's monthly examination. Colton had arranged it and had apparently made it clear to the doctor that sobriety was a condition of payment. Whitfield arrived mostly steady, his one good hand carrying his medical bag, his eyes clear enough. The examination went well. The baby was positioned correctly, heartbeat strong, size appropriate. Whitfield pronounced everything normal and then retired to the kitchen where Martha poured him coffee. Sarah was upstairs resting. She needed water and came to the top of the stairs. Voices floated up from the kitchen. Whitfield's, loosened by whatever he had slipped into his coffee from the flask in his coat. "At least this time there is a doctor present, not like before when Eliza." Martha's voice came sharp as a blade. "Quiet. There is nobody. Sarah is upstairs. Whitfield, careless and unaware. Poor Drake. Lost his wife, lost the baby, and now he is." I said, "Quiet, James." Silence fell. But it was too late. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs with her hand on the banister and her heart cracking open. Lost his wife, lost the baby. She descended the stairs slowly. Martha saw her coming and the color left the older woman's face. Whitfield looked up from his coffee and had the decency to go pale. "Tell me," Sarah said. "Everything," Martha told her. Eliza Ann Mercer had married Colton Drake in the spring of 1864, just before he rode south with the Confederate cavalry. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher from Virginia, a quiet, gentle woman who loved books and wildflowers, and the man she had married with a devotion that everyone in Silver Creek still remembered. When Colton came back from the war, Eliza was pregnant. The winter of 1864 was the worst on record. November brought blizzards that buried the fences and killed cattle standing in the fields. Eliza went into labor during the worst storm of the season. That same night, rustlers hit the ranch. 20 head of cattle driven off into the blizzard. Colton rode out after them. 3 hours in a whiteout, chasing men and animals through snow that was chest-deep on thunder. When he came back, the old midwife, Mrs. Granger, was kneeling in blood on the bedroom floor. Eliza had hemorrhaged. The baby, a boy, was stillborn. Eliza was barely conscious, her life pouring out of her in a tide that no amount of pressure or prayer could stop. She died in Colton's arms an hour before dawn. He buried her and the baby on the hill behind the house, the small grave with the wooden cross that Sarah had stood before on her first morning at the ranch. Then Martha told her the rest, the part that no one else knew. Before she died, Eliza wrote him a letter. She knew she was in danger. She had been bleeding for days before the labor, and the midwife had warned her it could go badly. She wrote the letter and put it in her Bible. What did it say? Martha recited from memory, the words worn smooth by repetition. Do not live alone, Colton. Do not let this house go silent. Find someone who sees the man I married, not the man the war made. Let someone love you. For me. Please. He has read that letter 1,000 times, Martha whispered. And he never did what she asked. Until you. Sarah sat very still. The kitchen was quiet, except for the tick of the clock and the sound of her own breathing. She processed what she had heard, turning it over, examining it from every angle the way she examined a patient's symptoms before making a diagnosis. And then the pain hit. Not physical pain. Something deeper. Something that went all the way down to the foundation of whatever she and Colton had been building. He had Eliza's permission. He had his dead wife's own words telling him it was all right to love again. And he still could not tell Sarah the truth. He still could not trust her enough to say, I was married before. She died. She told me to find someone, and I found you. He did not trust me, Sarah said. The words came out flat, drained of emotion, which was worse than anger. He let me sleep in her room, wear his mother's ring, walk through her house, and he never once thought I was strong enough to hear the truth. Martha reached for her hand. Sarah, he was trying to protect. Protect who? Her or me? Because it seems like he was protecting himself. From having to feel it again. From having to watch someone look at him with pity instead of love. She stood. The chair scraped against the floor. Her belly felt impossibly heavy, as if grief had a physical weight that settled right on top of the child she was carrying. I came here with nothing, Sarah said. I had no home, no family, no name. I accepted all of that. I accepted the locked room, the nightmares, the silence. I accepted a marriage to a stranger because I believed he was offering me something real, not a replacement for what he lost. Something real. Something that belonged to me and not to a ghost. Martha was crying, as Sarah was not. She had gone past tears into the cold, clear space where decisions get made. That night, the rain came. Hard, cold, late autumn Montana rain that was 2 degrees from being sleet. The kind of rain that kills exposed livestock and turns mountain trails into rivers of mud. Sarah wrote a short letter and placed it on the kitchen table. She put on her coat, picked up her carpet bag, the same one she had carried out of her father's house in Boston, the same one she had carried into Silver Creek. She opened the front door and stepped into the rain. Buck saw her from the barn. He came running, his old legs covering the ground faster than she would have thought possible. Mrs. Drake, where are you going? Away, in this rain. You are 8 months. I know how pregnant I am, Buck. Her voice shook, cold and pain and everything at once. Tell him I am not Eliza, and I refuse to be the ghost he uses to replace another ghost. She walked into the darkness. The rain swallowed her in 3 steps. Colton Drake returned to his house from the north pasture, expecting the lamp in the kitchen window. Instead, he found darkness. He found the letter on the table, read it by the light of a match he struck with shaking hands. The match burned his fingers. He did not notice. For the first time in the story, the reader sees Colton truly shatter. Not the cold face, not the granite control, not the careful distance he maintained between himself and the world. He sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the wall and the letter in his hands and could not breathe, gasping. The walls closing in. The same paralysis he had felt the night Eliza died, the same helplessness, the same crushing certainty that he had failed the person who needed him most. Buck came through the door, water streaming from his hat. She is gone. 15 minutes, on foot toward town. Colton looked up. Buck had known this man for 15 years through war and peace and grief and the slow, patient work of building something from nothing. He had never seen what he saw now in Colton's eyes. Raw, unprocessed terror. She is walking, in this rain, the mountain road, the rock slide section. I tried to stop. Colton was out the door before Buck finished the sentence, thunder at a full gallop in sheeting rain. The mountain trail had turned treacherous. Loose shale was slick with water and mud. Silver Creek roared in its banks, swollen with runoff, the sound drowning out everything else. The switchbacks above the rock slide were barely visible in the darkness. He called her name. The wind ate his voice. Thunder stumbled on loose rock, and Colton hauled the horse back to its feet and kept going. In his mind, another night played itself out like a theater reel, the same trail, the same rain. But 4 years ago, he had been riding away from his wife, chasing stolen cattle into a blizzard. Tonight, he was riding toward the woman he loved. Same storm, same fear, different choice. Not again. God, please, not again. Sarah had made it 2 miles. The rain was freezing. Not quite sleet, but close enough that her wool coat was soaked through, and the cold had settled into her bones like something permanent. Every step was agony, swollen feet on sharp rocks. The weight of her belly pulling her forward, throwing off her balance on the sloping trail. Then the pain came. Not ordinary discomfort. A deep clenching contraction that bent her double and drove the air from her lungs. She grabbed a pine trunk and breathed through it the way she had read about in Henry's textbooks. Controlled breathing, measured exhales, riding the pain like a wave. She knew enough medicine to recognize what was happening. Premature contractions brought on by stress and cold and physical strain. She was 5 to 6 weeks from her due date. This could not happen here. Not on a mountainside in the rain and the dark. A second contraction hit, stronger. She gasped, and her feet went out from under her at the rock slide section. She went down on one knee. Creek water, icy and shin-deep, rushed around her legs. She clawed her way to a massive ponderosa pine at the trail's edge and wedged herself between the exposed roots, curling her body around her belly like a shell around the soft creature inside. For the first time since Boston, Sarah prayed. The lantern on Thunder's saddle swept across the darkness. The beam caught the pale fabric of her coat against the dark roots, a patch of wrong color in a world of black and brown. Colton was off the horse before it stopped, on his knees in the mud beside her. She was conscious but gray-faced, shaking so violently her teeth chattered, her arms wrapped around her belly. Colton. Her voice was thin as thread. I am here. The baby. Something is wrong. He lifted her. Did not speak about the letter, about Eliza, about any of it. He stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around her, mounted Thunder with Sarah cradled against his chest, and rode for the ranch at the fastest pace the terrain would allow. The hoofbeats were different now, not the slow, deliberate steps of the night he brought her to Triple D for the first time. These were desperate, driving, the sound of a man racing against every mistake he had ever made. Back at the ranch, Martha had water boiling and blankets warming by the fire. Buck had ridden for Dr. Whitfield the moment Sarah left. The doctor arrived 20 minutes after Colton carried Sarah through the door, sober but shaking. Not from drink this time, from fear. The trauma of his own surgical failures, the lost hand, the years of self-medication. When the stakes were life and death, his nerve failed him. Colton's fists clenched. The old rage rose like bile. He wanted to grab Whitfield by the collar and shake competence into him. But Sarah, even through the pain, grabbed Colton's hand and held it. Listen to me, I know what to do, but I need your help. Anything. Hot water, clean cloth, The green pouch in my herb bag. Calendula. And you need to stay calm. Can you do that? Yes, I need you to mean it. He met her eyes, forced the rage down, breathed. I mean it. Sarah directed her own emergency treatment. She coached Martha on warm compresses, showing her exactly where to place them and how much pressure to apply. She guided the trembling Whitfield through a manual check of the baby's position, talking him through it step by step with the calm authority of someone who had studied this in books and was now living it in her own body. She used controlled breathing to slow the contractions, administered her own herbal remedies. This was the moment where every secret hour spent reading Cousin Henry's forbidden textbooks, every risk she had taken studying medicine when her father said women had no business with such things, every ounce of her intelligence and her stubborn refusal to be less than she was, all of it paid off. She saved herself and her baby through knowledge and will and the bone-deep determination not to die on a mountainside because a man could not tell her the truth. The contractions stopped. The baby's heartbeat was strong. It was not time yet. Sarah was exhausted but safe. Everyone left the room eventually. Martha to make tea, Whitfield to collapse in the parlor, Buck to tend the horses. Colton sat on the floor beside the bed. His clothes were soaked. He had not changed, had not moved from her side since they returned. He held her hand in both of his split knuckles gentle around her fingers. She opened her eyes. I owe you the truth, he said. His voice was wrecked, stripped raw. She had never heard him sound like this. Yes, you do. Eliza was my wife. She died because I was not there when she needed me. Our son died with her. Silence. The lamp flickered. Rain hammered against the windows. When I saw you in Silver Creek, alone, pregnant, turned away by everyone, I saw Eliza. You are right. That is true. Sarah closed her eyes. Tears tracked from the corners down her temples and into her hair. But Sarah, he tightened his grip on her hand. That is why I stopped. It is not why I stayed. She opened her eyes. I stayed because of you. Because of the way you hold your head up when the whole world is looking down. Because you stitched that mare's leg without waiting to be asked. Because you laughed when I kissed your nose instead of your mouth. Because every morning I wake up thinking about you before I think about Eliza, and that has not happened once in 4 years. He paused, drew a breath that shuddered. She wrote me a letter before she died. She told me to find someone, to let someone love me. I read that letter 1,000 times and I could not do it. Then I met you and I could not stop myself. His eyes were wet. He did not try to hide it. I love you, Sarah, not because you are like Eliza, because you are Sarah. And I should have trusted you with all of this from the beginning. I was wrong. Sarah looked at him for a long time, reading his face the way she read symptoms, looking for the truth beneath the surface. She found it. Prove it, she whispered, not with words, with time. He nodded, did not argue, did not make promises, just nodded and kept holding her hand and stayed on that floor all night, while the rain hammered down and the lamp burned low and the baby slept safely inside her. 2 weeks passed. Sarah stayed. Not because she had forgiven everything, but because she chose to give Colton the chance to prove himself through action rather than words. And he did. He opened the locked room, took the key from around his neck and placed it in her hand and said, "You should see this." They stood together in the preserved nursery, a hand-carved crib that Colton had built himself, the wood still smooth under Sarah's fingers, tiny clothes folded with care, a small painting that Eliza had made during her pregnancy, wildflowers in a mason jar. The colors faded, but still lovely. Colton wept, not the silent stoic tears of a man maintaining his dignity. Real weeping, the kind that bends you double and makes sounds you did not know you could make. Sarah held his hand through all of it. I want to pack these away, he said when the worst had passed. Not forget, but put them somewhere that is not between us. They packed Eliza's things together, placed the crates in the attic, together. He showed her the letter. Eliza's handwriting, small and careful on yellowed paper. Sarah read it twice. "Do not live alone, Colton. Do not let this house go silent. Find someone who sees the man I married, not the man the war made. Let someone love you. For me. Please." Sarah placed the letter back in his hands. "Keep it. It is part of who you are." And she was right. You deserve to be loved. The locked door stood open now. The room was empty. Sunlight came through the window for the first time in 4 years. Then Silas Garrett played his last card. A stranger rode into Silver Creek on a Tuesday. Well-dressed, Eastern accent. Hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. Edward Langley, senior partner at Langley and Associates of Boston, had come a very long way to cause trouble. Garrett had hired a private investigator months ago to dig into Sarah's past. The man had tracked her from Boston to Chicago to Omaha to Helena and finally to Silver Creek. Garrett contacted Edward with an offer. "Come west. File a paternity and custody claim. Testify that Sarah fled with the child and that Colton Drake, a known violent criminal, coerced a vulnerable pregnant woman into a sham marriage. The goal was to delegitimize the Drake marriage in territorial court, destroy Colton's last shred of standing, and open the door for Garrett to challenge the land rights." Edward did not care about the baby. He cared about money. Garrett was paying handsomely, and he cared about control. Sarah had defied him by keeping the child, and men like Edward Langley did not tolerate defiance. They rode up to the Triple D on a Wednesday morning. Garrett on a fine chestnut mare. Edward on a rented horse he sat badly. Sheriff Dawson trailing behind them with a territorial court summons in his saddlebag and misery written across his face. Colton and Sarah were on the porch when they arrived. Buck was in the barn. Martha was in the kitchen. 2 ranch hands were mending fence within earshot. Edward dismounted, adjusted his cuffs, smiled at Sarah with the particular expression of a man looking at something he believed he owned. "Sarah, you look different. Do not call me by my first name, Mr. Langley. Still sharp. I always liked that about you. Get to the point. The point is that child is mine by blood. I have a legal right to." Colton stepped forward. Every inch of his 6'4" frame placed itself between Edward and Sarah. His voice dropped to the register that had made men lay down their arms at Chickamauga. "That child is mine. The birth record will say, Drake, she is my wife. You have no claim here." Edward produced the court summons with a flourish. "A territorial judge will decide that, especially when he hears about your history of violence, Mr. Drake. I believe there was an incident just last month. A man beaten nearly to death outside the saloon." Garrett stood behind Edward, smiling the smile of a man who has finally drawn the winning hand. Sarah placed her hand on Colton's arm. He looked at her. She looked back, steady, clear. The woman who had climbed out a window in Boston. The woman who had faced down a Montana winter alone. The woman who had saved her own baby on a mountainside through knowledge and will and the absolute refusal to break. "Trust me," she said. He hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed to put himself between her and danger. But her eyes held his, and he remembered her words from that night on the floor beside her bed. "Prove it, not with words." He stepped aside. Sarah faced Edward directly. "Sit down, Edward. I have some things to say, and I would prefer you not embarrass yourself by fainting." She turned to the assembled group. Dawson, Garrett, Buck, who had emerged from the barn, Martha standing in the kitchen doorway, the ranch hands, who had drifted closer. "Mr. Langley is a senior partner at Langley and Associates in Boston. He has a wife, Margaret, and 3 children. He conducted an affair with me for 6 months using the name James Ward. He told me he was unmarried. When I became pregnant, he revealed his true identity and told me to handle it." Edward's composure cracked. "You cannot prove." "I have your letters." Dead silence. Sarah held his gaze without blinking. She had burned those letters months ago, 1 in her father's parlor and 2 in the cook stove at Triple D. But Edward did not know that. Every letter you wrote me under the name James Ward. Your handwriting, your pet names, details about your family that only a wife or a mistress would know. If you pursue this custody claim, those letters go to Margaret, and to the Boston Bar Association, and to every newspaper between here and Beacon Hill. Edward went the color of old snow. Sarah turned to Garrett, and the steel in her voice went up a notch. "Mr. Garrett, you damned Silver Creek above our property line. You have been pressuring homesteaders to sell at below-value prices for 2 years. The Tucker family will testify to that. So will the Hendersons, the Porters, and at least 3 other families I have spoken to in the past month. I have been busy while you thought I was just a pregnant woman sitting in a ranch house." Garrett's smile died. "If you pursue any legal action against my husband's land rights, those families will file a collective complaint with the Territorial Land Office in Helena. I have already drafted the paperwork." Buck delivered a copy to the Territorial Marshal's office last week. She turned to Dawson. "Mr. Dawson, you are a decent man in an indecent position. I know Garrett holds something over you. I do not know what, and I do not care. But if you choose right today, if you serve the law instead of the man paying for it, this ends here, for everyone." Dawson looked at Garrett, looked at Sarah, looked at Colton, who was standing behind his wife with an expression of pure, stunned awe. "Mr. Garrett," Dawson said. His voice trembled but held. "I think you had best leave this property." Edward did not wait for a formal dismissal. He was on his rented horse and pointing it east before Dawson finished speaking, calculating the fastest route back to Boston before those letters, real or imagined, could reach his wife. Garrett stared at Sarah with genuine hatred, but he had no cards left. The homesteader's complaint was real. The territorial marshal had a copy. His water scheme was documented. He turned his horse and rode. "This is not over, Drake," he said. Colton spoke for the first time since Sarah had taken the floor. "Yeah, it is." They watched the riders disappear down the mountain trail. Dust settled. Silence. Colton turned to Sarah. "You kept his letters. I burned them the week I left Boston." "Then how?" "Edward does not know that." A beat of silence. Then Colton Drake, the most feared man in the Montana Territory, laughed. A real, full, genuine laugh that echoed off the barn walls and startled the horses and made Buck grin and Martha cover her mouth with both hands. Sarah smiled, then winced. Her hand went to her belly. "Colton?" "What?" "It was not the bluff that did it, I think." Another contraction. She gripped his arm. "The baby. For real this time." Dr. Whitfield arrived sober. Buck had confiscated every bottle of whiskey on the ranch 3 days earlier. "Accidentally dropped them all," he told the doctor with a straight face. "Real shame. But the baby was breech." Whitfield's one good hand trembled. The procedure he needed to perform, turning the baby from the outside, required precision and steadiness he was not sure he had. Colton stood beside the bed and lived his nightmare in real time. Wife in labor, complications, the smell of blood and fear. Every cell in his body remembered the last time. The blizzard, the empty house, Eliza's face going white, his son small and still and blue, and he wanted to run. The animal panic surged through him like floodwater, the same blind flight instinct that had sent him charging into a blizzard 4 years ago, chasing cattle instead of staying with the woman who needed him. But he did not run. He forced himself to stand at Sarah's side. Forced his hands to be steady when hers gripped them hard enough to grind bone. This was the moment he broke the cycle. The moment he chose differently than he had chosen before. Sarah, even through the agony, directed Whitfield. She talked him through the version, telling him where to press and how hard and when to stop. Knowledge from Cousin Henry's textbooks. Knowledge that had been forbidden to her, and that she had stolen anyway. And now it was saving her child's life. Martha held her legs. Colton held her hands. Whitfield worked with a concentration that burned the tremor out of his remaining hand. The baby turned. Sarah pushed. The room narrowed to sound and effort and the raw mechanics of bringing life into the world. Dawn light came through the window. One final push. A cry filled the room. Strong, furious, demanding the world. "It is a girl," Whitfield said, and his voice broke. Colton cut the cord. His hands, the hands that had killed men and broken Virgil Crane's face and built a ranch from bare ground, trembled as they wrapped a tiny body in soft cloth. He placed the baby in Sarah's arms. She looked down. Small face. Dark eyes that seemed too knowing for a creature minutes old. A mouth already open and wailing. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered. "I am your mama." The baby's fist closed around Sarah's finger. Colton knelt beside the bed. His face was wet and he did not try to hide it. "What is her name?" Sarah looked at him. This man who had claimed her child before it was born, who had given them both his name and his protection. And somewhere in the stumbling dark of their shared damage, his entire heart. "Grace," she said, "because that is what you gave us, what we gave each other." "Grace Drake," Colton whispered. He leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead, a breath of a kiss, barely there. Then he pressed his lips to Sarah's temple and said quietly enough that only she and the baby and God could hear, "Welcome to the world, little one. I am your papa, and I will love you and your mama every single day I have left on this earth." 2 weeks later, on a clear autumn morning, Colton carried Grace to the hilltop behind the house, to the grave. He stood before the small wooden cross with his daughter in his arms. "This is Grace," he said to the grave, "your sister. You would like her Eliza. She has got a voice on her that could call cattle from 3 valleys." Sarah stood beside him. She took his free hand and held it. Then she placed a sprig of wild sage on the grave. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, "for loving him first, for teaching him how." Colton looked at her. The pain was still there in his eyes. It would always be there, a scar as permanent as the one on his face. But beside the pain was peace, hope, tomorrow. Back in town, life was changing. Sheriff Dawson opened a formal investigation into Garrett's water diversion and coerced land purchases. The town council, pressured by the Homestead families Sarah had helped over the past months, voted to compel Garrett to dismantle the dam. Garrett was not arrested. This was the territorial West, and money still bought distance from consequences. But his influence was shattered. He sold his claim and left for the mining camps in Colorado. Ellen Hartwell came to the ranch bearing a baby quilt and a secret she had carried for weeks. Her daughter Clara was pregnant out of wedlock and could no longer hide it. Over coffee, with tears running down her face, Ellen asked Sarah for help. Sarah promised discretion and medical care. The chain of judgment that had exiled Sarah from Silver Creek began to break from the inside, one act of mercy extending to the next. Colton deeded Buck a 40-acre parcel adjacent to Triple D land ownership for a free black man in 1868 Montana, a thing that carried weight beyond measure. Buck accepted with a handshake and 2 words, "About time." Martha decided to stay. "Who is going to feed this circus if I leave?" she said. But she also, for the first time, placed her hand on Grace's cradle and smiled in a way that was not tinged with grief. She had accepted that this child did not erase Eliza. It continued the family Eliza had wanted Colton to build. On a Sunday morning, the Drake family rode into Silver Creek for church. Sarah carried Grace against her chest. Colton drove the wagon. The church doors stood open. They walked down the aisle. Every head turned. Ruth Tucker stood from her pew and moved aside, offering her seat. 3rd row, center. A good seat. A respected seat. Her husband stood with her. Then the Hendersons, then the Porters, then Ellen Hartwell, who caught Sarah's eye and nodded once. No one applauded. No one made a speech. They simply made room. In a small western town that was the loudest acceptance there was. Colton and Sarah sat down. Grace slept in her father's arms. The Reverend began his sermon. Sarah glanced at the man beside her, the scarred face, the hands that had killed and built and broken and healed, and now cradled a sleeping infant as though she were made of spun glass and starlight. He felt her gaze and turned, smiled. The small one, the private one, the one that belonged to her alone. Outside the church windows, the Bitterroot Mountains wore their first heavy snow of the season. Winter was coming to Montana, brutal and unforgiving and indifferent to human plans. But Sarah was not afraid. She had survived worse winters than any mountain could deliver. That evening, she stood at the bedroom window. Grace asleep in the cradle Colton had built with his own hands, sanding the wood smooth as silk. Below in the yard, Colton was working with the new pup Buck had brought from town, trying to teach it to sit. The dog would not cooperate. Colton repeated the command, repeated it, repeated it. The dog sat. Colton rubbed its ears and straightened and looked up at the window. He saw her watching. He did not wave, did not call out, just placed his hand flat against his chest over his heart, and then extended it toward her. Open palm, a gesture that meant everything and needed no words. Sarah pressed her hand to the cold glass. Behind her, Grace breathed in the steady rhythm of a child who had never known a world without safety. Ahead of her, Colton Drake stood in the yard of the ranch he had built from ash and grief and stubborn will, under a Montana sky salted with more stars than a Boston girl had ever imagined existed. Sarah lowered her hand, reached for the lamp. But before she turned it down, she whispered, not to Colton, not to Grace, but to the girl who had once sat shivering on a bench in Silver Creek, alone in the dark, believing with every broken piece of her heart that no one in this world would ever want her. She was wrong. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.